Good day, dear colleagues. I'm Dr. Vasyl Kucherenko of RMIT University, Vietnam, and my presentation is a theoretical inquiry, reflection on what I call the Hydra effect. It explores how state media bans meant to fight disinformation can instead create new vulnerabilities. The Hydra from Greek myth grew two heads for every one cut off. Likewise, it means trying to eliminate one problem, we may produce new ones. And this, I argue, is what also happens when states restrict media, foreign media mostly, in the name of fighting propaganda and disinformation. So today, information has really become an even more dangerous weapon, a key instrument in hybrid conflicts. Governments now increasingly treat the media landscape as battlefield, which must be controlled. With this purpose, recently governments have increasingly resorted to instruments of censorship, designating a range of media as propagandistic and disinformational. Here in the table, you can see some recent examples of state media bans. Naturally, the table is not exhaustive. A number of cases of examples relate specifically to the Russia-Ukraine conflict, but the practice is spreading globally more and more, and this seems like a quite worrying trend overall that may only intensify over time. These measures, yes, claim to protect the public from false information, false narratives, yet such measures also imply that first, the public lacks critical thinking, media literacy skills, and second, that all remaining permitted media automatically supposed to tell the truth, right? This logic leads to a key question. Do media bans make societies more or less susceptible to disinformation? I suggest that in the short run, bans may reduce exposure and spread of it to disinformation. But in the long term, they can increase vulnerability through several psychological mechanisms such as psychological reactance, illusory truth effect, polarized consciousness, learned helplessness. These mechanisms affect different population groups. Some become more skeptical or cynical, others become more passive. How big the segment site is a question for further research, as well as about factors strengthening or weakening the influence of these psychological mechanisms. I will touch this aspect a bit later. Let's now look at each of the mechanisms briefly. So, psychological reactance. When people feel their access to information is restricted, they try to restore their restricted freedom. Banned sources become more attractive. People find ways around restrictions via VPNs, messengers like Telegram, etc., or even word of mouth. This resistance can evolve into distrust of all official sources and even information nihilism, when people believe anything alternative or forbidden as more credible, regardless of truth. One of crucial mediating factors here is the public trust toward the state institutions and national media as well, yes. However, the value of personal freedom shouldn't also be neglected here, as it can outweigh in its influence, any trust towards state institutions and national media. The illusory truth effect shows that repetition makes even false statements seem true. Under censorship, though, this also works a bit differently. When only approved media remain, they create a kind of an information monopoly. So audiences then may assume what's repeated there must be true. This is a kind of illusory truth effect from monopoly. Why? Because without comparison of alternative perspectives, people can detect distortions, selective omissions, other context manipulation, which are the most subtle forms of information manipulation. Next, controlled media often frame the world in simple black and white terms: us versus them, good versus evil, etc. This simplified dichotomous worldview reduces people's ability to think critically as well, erodes their ability for nuanced thinking. Authorities can then easily label dissenting views as propaganda and disinformation. thus discrediting them even before audiences engage with these views. This is a kind of proactive strategy of toxic labeling that reinforces polarization. Finally, prolonged exposure to simplified narratives leads to learned helplessness. People lose faith in their ability to evaluate information or influence events. They become passive, anxious, and disengaged, ready to accept whatever is presented to them. This paves the way for deeper manipulation and civic disengagement. So I suggest that in long-term perspective, media bans foster susceptibility to disinformation due to the synergy of all these mechanisms, thus creating information vacuum first when alternative views disappear. As a result, there is a decline in the quality of media coverage from permitted media on the controversial topics, just because there are no competitive alternative viewpoints and explanations. This leads to critical skills atrophy. People stop asking questions, verifying sources, comparing facts. And finally, axiomatic perception, when official narratives become unquestioned truth. As a result, society is more controllable, yet more deceivable. Together, all these form the Hydra effect, a self-reinforcing cycle. So when over time censorship weakens critical thinking, which in turn amplifies susceptibility to disinformation, governments then justify new bans, competing this vicious cycle. So instead of unity against external threats, societies become internally more polarized and mutually distrustful, the very Hydra effect. The scale of the effects is a complex, multifactorial, context-dependent matter. In particular, in further research, not only widely studied trust in authority, media literacy skills, digital literacy skills, and all that stuff should be taken into account and measured, but also the value of personal freedom, the quality of media coverage by the permitted media after media bans were imposed, the need to understand the issue, which is not possible from consuming one-sided information only, right? As to recommendations made at this stage of the theoretical inquiry may seem generic, but still I believe it could be useful to consider for governments shifting the focus from censorship to resilience, investing in critical thinking, media and digital literacy skills development, especially within education and state institutions, possibly with the further passing the relevant tests, so formalizing thus this skill development. Teaching citizens, of course, to spot, recognize increasingly relevant AI-driven disinformation as well. And for citizens, it is important to treat critical thinking and media literacy skills as a social responsibility, remembering that it's not only a personal skill, it's the foundation of democratic resilience in the information age. Thank you very much, dear colleagues, for your attention. If you have questions or points to discuss, you will find my contact details in the conference materials. Thank you.